Hi there, still talking about global climate change and impacts. Another impact of climate change is going to be changes to precipitation patterns, like what areas are receiving a lot of precipitation, some areas are going to receive less. That's kind of significant because that's going to affect, where we can live and what crops we can grow. Um, whoop. So, mostly when we're talking about changes in precipitation patterns, we're focusing on human impacts, specifically financial or economic impacts. I had already mentioned crop yields. If a place is drier than normal, you're not going to be able to grow the normal crops you can. More rainfall means there's going to be more erosion of the soil. Erosion just means the soil is moving from one place to another. A hard rain is going to, hit the ground. It's going to push the soil particles around. Maybe some places are seeing less precipitation. That's going to have an impact on our drinking water supplies. Areas that are drier than normal, that's going to encourage wildfires. So, changes in precipitation. And all of these things that are listed on here are all economic, not just environmental, but economic. They all relate to, humans' ability to survive, I guess you could say. Other impacts of climate change: ocean circulation patterns. There's what we call a global conveyor belt. It is a big old current that goes from like the surface down deep and it wraps around the whole planet. And it's carrying warm water from one location and cold water from another location, and it helps regulate our climate. Kind of important. But this big conveyor belt current is based on temperature and salinity of the water. So think about it. As the planet is getting warmer, that's going to change the current because there's going to be more warm water. As things like glaciers are melting and adding fresh water to the ocean, that's going to change the salinity or the salt level in the water as well, and that's going to affect that current. So no one's 100% sure what will happen if this current were to be like majorly disrupted. It's going to clearly have a big impact on the planet, but no one's 100% sure like exactly what will happen. So just going to keep that in mind. These currents, like this global conveyor belt, which help regulate climate, they may be disrupted, and who knows what havoc will come from that. If you've ever seen the wonderful movie The Day After Tomorrow, if you haven't watched it, you should. They mention this global conveyor belt current in the movie. The current stops, and when the current stops, the havoc that is wrought. There's these 3 big storms that you can see here that look like hurricanes but are actually like cold hurricanes, and New York City here on the left and on the right gets completely snowed in, and I'm not going to ruin the ending for you. But yeah, it's based on the global conveyor belt. Some other impacts of climate change. I've already mentioned agriculture, so I think we have established that. Human-wise, people are going to have to leave their countries. We're going to have more environmental refugees. The island nation of the Maldives is only like a meter, maybe, above sea level. And so as sea level begins rising, the people that are living in these low-lying areas like the Maldives, where are they going to go? They're going to have to find a new place to go. So countries are going to have to deal with environmental refugees. Human-wise, or continuing with the human impact here, drought and heat and going to cause disruption of our food supply. Heat stroke and things like that will become much more prevalent. Diseases will spread into new areas. Like right now, many diseases that are carried or transmitted by insects are limited. They can't go into the colder regions because insects can't survive. But if those cold regions end up warming up, then insects will be able to get into them, and then they will carry the diseases to the people that are living in those cold regions, or temperate regions. And so these are just some impacts of climate change that you should consider. This little graphic here showing mosquitoes, and their range will be changing as well. The warmer it gets, the further north the mosquitoes are going to go, and the mosquitoes are going to carry a bunch of diseases with them. So you can pause it here and take a look at the maps and the distribution. This graph here, keep having to move my picture, my face. This graph is pretty much looking at birds and the bird life cycle, I guess you could say, laying eggs and eggs hatching and things like that. So timing-wise, a warmer planet might throw off the reproductive cycle of different animals. These animals here, these particular birds, are feeding on a type of insect called a crane fly. And so crane fly are being born at an earlier time, and these birds, which eat the crane fly, or the chicks eat the crane fly, the birds haven't shifted their reproduction yet. So when these chicks are being born, there's no food for them. And so these are, connections that we need to make as we change one thing on the planet. That's going to have ramifications on other things. So again, this little graphic is showing a type of fly called a crane fly, and these birds, or the chicks, the babies, are eating crane fly. However, the crane fly are being born earlier in the year than the chicks are. They used to be born at the same time. Perfect, I got your food source. But the flies are being born earlier because it's warmer earlier, and then the chicks are still being born at their same original time. So let's say the flies and the chicks normally used to be born, we'll say, in May. Chicks are eating the flies, happy. But now the flies are reproducing earlier in the year, we'll say February. And that's because it's warmer in February. And now the chicks are still being hatched or birthed. Not really births, because there's no live birth in a bird. But the chicks are hatching still in May, but there's no flies. They've already been the babies, the larvae of the fly, which are little worms. The larvae are long gone at this point in time. So that's going to affect bird populations too. Another huge impact of a warming planet is that of coral bleaching. Let's talk about it real fast. Hope I don't run out of time. So, coral normally has algae living inside of it in a symbiotic relationship. Both organisms benefit. The coral benefits and the algae benefits, which means this is a mutualistic relationship. Plus, both organisms benefit. The algae benefits, they live inside the coral. They have a place to live. The algae also uses carbon dioxide from the coral to help them photosynthesize. The coral, what does it get from having an algae living inside of it? The coral gets food because the algae are photosynthesizing and producing glucose, and now the coral has glucose to eat. So everybody's happy. However, what happens is when water temperatures change and it gets warmer, coral gets very stressed. Coral has a very, very limited range of temperatures where it can thrive and survive. So as we get out of that range, the coral gets stressed because it's too hot. And when coral gets stressed, it kicks the algae out. It's like, bye, get out of here. This is how it responds to stress. It is not a healthy stress response because the coral needs that algae because it needs the glucose that the algae is producing via photosynthesis. So the coral kicks out the algae and essentially starves to death. And the coral polyps, which are like tiny little anemones, they die off, leaving just the coral skeleton behind, and that coral skeleton is white in color. And that is where we get the term bleaching, because all we see is that white coral skeleton and not like living coral, which is kind of like an olive green color. This map here showing the Great Barrier Reef off the northeastern coast of Australia. It's showing how much of the Great Barrier Reef has experienced bleaching events. I mean, look at this, 81% severely bleached, 33%. The southern sector is doing a little bit better. But this is happening not just on the Great Barrier Reef, but on coral reefs everywhere, even down here in the Florida Keys. Lots of bleaching happening. Another impact of climate change that it goes along with climate change is ocean acidification. And I'm going to not really focus on that here because we have a whole topic about ocean acidification. So you can just kind of take a look at it, and we'll come back to that later on in the year. So how do we deal with all this, all of these problems? That's a great question that we don't really have the perfect answer to. But, it's hard to deal with climate change because what we're talking about is something that happens around the world, so everyone is affected by it, and you can't come up with like a worldwide law that all the countries are going to obey. Climate change is going to have long-lasting impacts. It's hard to make changes when we won't see the product of those changes for quite some time. So that's a big problem. Climate change is obviously political. We're not getting into the politics of it, but clearly there's a political component. And, a huge problem is that, like, some places are like, yeah, this is great. It's going to get warmer. Yay. And then other places are suffering negative effects. So it's really hard to there is no one size fits all solution here. And the main idea, though, is like to fix the problem of climate change, we have to burn fewer fossil fuels. And that means we have to change our lifestyle. And nobody wants to do that. We got to get everybody on board. Major law pertaining to greenhouse gas emissions that you do need to know. You do need to know 10 laws for this course. This is the first one that we're going to talk about. The Kyoto Protocol. Basically, it's establishing greenhouse gas emissions standards for how much every country can release. It was signed in the late 90s. And by 2012, all the countries that had signed on to it were supposed to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Great in theory, but in practice, it didn't really work out. The United States never even ratified it because they were like, hey, it's not, or we, the United States was like, hey, it's not really fair that India and China, both of which are developing countries and are releasing a lot of greenhouse gases, they were kind of exempt from this because they're developing. And so the U.S. was like, we don't think that's fair. If you're going to penalize us and make us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, so should China and India. But we didn't ratify it, and not all countries have reduced their greenhouse gas emissions. So some other ways to deal with climate change, aside from like international laws like the Kyoto Protocol, make small changes, sustainable transportation, switch to renewable energy instead of using fossil fuels and things like that. We can mitigate and adapt. Mitigate means basically, in this essence, like it says down at the bottom here, mitigation is looking at worldwide. Adaptation is individuals or local things. When you mitigate something, you're trying to reduce the impacts. Adaptation is more like, let's work with what we have rather than fix the problem. Let's just deal with the problem and let it keep going. So you as an individual, things that you could do to reduce your impacts to contributing to global climate change. Lots of things listed on here. Do I expect you to do all of that? No, of course not. But I do want you to understand the impact that these changes will make. Lastly, wrapping things up, a great site for all things climate change related is called Skeptical Science. It's got all of the myths that people tout about climate change, and it actually has scientific data that combats those myths. So it's a great website that you should check out. That finishes up 9.5. If you have questions, let me know. Bye.